Hi, I'm Mike Thompson. In this video I'm going to show you how we're going to build stuff with cardboard. This will help you avoid some of the aggravation and pitfalls that I've found over the years. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the basic structure of cardboard. Now, in the boat races that I compete in, you're only allowed to use single-walled corrugated cardboard. What this means is you've got 2 layers of craft paper that sandwich a layer of corrugated craft paper. Simple enough. Double wall, if you've seen that before, some of you may be allowed to use it, but it has another layer here. It's more like a Big Mac. It's got paper, corrugations, paper, corrugations, paper. If you look at it from the top, you can see that there appears to be what I'll call a grain structure. And this simply, if you look, you can see where the tops of the corrugations are, because that's where the glue lines are on the top of the paper. And these lines are really nice to reference for measuring and cutting from. Speaking of measuring and cutting, this is a tip that I think will really help you out quite a bit. Because cardboard has a grain structure and these corrugations here, there's a few things to note when you're going to go to cut it. Try to always cut it either at a peak or a valley of a corrugation if you can. Anytime you're making a cut that is parallel to the grain, try to cut it there. If you don't, what's going to happen is your blade is going to try to wander. It's going to follow these corrugations up and down. So what you'll have is you'll be cutting along nice, and then you'll cross another corrugation, and then you'll cross another one. And what you'll end up with is a sort of sawtooth pattern. It'll work if you don't need a nice straight edge, but try to avoid it if possible. If you really want a precise edge, make sure that any cut you make is at least 30 degrees offset from your grain. I always try to make perpendicular cuts where possible, but as long as you stay at least 30 degrees offset from your grain, you'll be able to get nice straight cuts because your blade isn't going to want to follow those corrugations quite so much. Another thing is folding. Same rules kind of apply with folding as they do with cutting. You want to make sure that if you're going to do a fold, try to make it as perpendicular as possible. Obviously straight across is best, but as long as you stay 30 degrees, you'll get fairly accurate folds. Now what you're going to want to do is try to arrange it so that your fold is going to occur at either a peak or a valley. Of course, if you're going to fold this way, fold up, you want to score it so that you're scoring a valley section, because it will bend a lot better because you only have one layer to score and try to force to bend, because it's the side that you're going to bend into is the side that's going to deform, whereas the other side is going to stretch. And if you're talking about trying to deform this cardboard, it's much easier to just deform one layer than two. So try to fold in one of the valleys here if you're going to fold this direction. Another thing to note about folding is where you measure from. Now, if you're just going to make, say, a nice right angle that's going to end up being a right angle, make sure that whenever you go to lay out your measurement on your cardboard, that you measure the outside of your fold, because the outside corner isn't going to go anywhere. If you're referencing the inside corner, what happens is the cardboard corner doesn't make a nice sharp corner. It actually deforms and does something like this. So your nice measurement that you used to have would now be down in this little crack somewhere. So make sure that you're always referencing the outside corner. You can reference the inside corners. In my case, I found that it's 3 30-seconds additional if you're going to do an inside bend. My cardboard is 5 30-seconds thick, and I found that 3 30-seconds is the nice additional length to add on in order to make that work. I try to avoid it where possible, but when I do, I'll add 3 30-seconds. While we're talking about bending things, you're probably going to want to make things that might look like that. Cardboard, you can bend it in 2 ways. You can bend it with the grain, or you can bend it across the grain. Now, if you're going to bend it across the grain, So if we look at it like this, into it, bending it across the grain, I'm going to call it, would be bending this edge up or down like that. That's great for very, very small bends, but it's going to want to buckle anytime the slightest little force impinges on any of these corrugated sections. So if you need a really nice, elegant curve, I recommend you try to bend it with the grain so that it has a nice, that way the grain will run parallel to whatever curve you're making. Now, of course, you're going to need to support this curve. To get this curve to stay like that on its own, you're going to have to get kind of tricky with water and then let it dry, and water and let it dry. I don't ever recommend doing that. What you'd want to do for this is make a sandwich panel. So you'd have one layer of grain that, depending on how you're going to orient this, you might want the center section grain to be perpendicular to this, so it would come out of the board like that, and your third section might go like that. But if you need a freestanding funky shape like that, you have to build a sandwich panel. If you don't need it to be freestanding, and you have support ribs, obviously orient them such that the grain in each one runs parallel to these right here, and orient your supports radially from your curve, if possible. The reason we orient our support rib grain this direction is because this piece is going to want to flex like this. So our greatest force is radially from here, so we want all of our corrugations aligned like that. And then, of course, you would glue, say, we'll pretend that the whiteboard is a giant piece of cardboard. You would just glue this, right down on it as if we're looking from the top. Of course, now if you wanted to orient this in the other plane to make, say, oh gosh, I don't know, if this were a skateboard ramp and we were looking at it from the side, you'd want these supports obviously oriented vertically for the most part. And that's easy to do, but it is going to kind of want to tilt these, so you're going to need support ribs between these as well to hold them upright, because this is going to try to flex, and as this corner flexes, it's going to want to pull this way, and this one's going to go this way, and but anyway. Make sure you use enough supports, but the fewest possible. The next thing that you're probably going to want to do is cut some curves, because you can't do flat things forever. If you're going to cut a curve, the same rules apply as cutting previously. You want to try to orient things so that the majority of your radius portion is perpendicular to the grain. So what this means is, if you're cutting an arc, you're going to want to orient your arc like this, because your radius, they're all pointing this direction, and so this orientation is more perpendicular to the grain than, say, this orientation would be. If you need a nice precise curve, you've got to go perpendicular for the same reasons I mentioned before. Otherwise your blade, right here, it's going to be really tricky. Your blade will not be able to follow this contour very closely, because you're crossing this corrugation at an angle that's very shallow in 2 times. So definitely make sure you orient your curves like that if possible. For maximum crushing strength, if you have tension or compression, make sure that you orient your forces parallel to your grain. So if you're going to try to pull this apart or crush it, orient it such that it's working parallel to all these corrugations, so that you have the most amount of craft paper resisting your force. It does okay in this direction, perpendicular, but in plane, it is prone to buckling though. So if you can, either make a sandwich panel, which I'll talk about in just a second, or add some stiffening ribs on one side or the other to prevent buckling. If you're going to apply forces this way, you have to be careful to make sure that you have thick enough cardboard, of course, to resist puncture. The second you crush this, it's going to lose pretty much all structural integrity in any other dimension. So try to avoid crushing your corrugations whenever possible. Double or triple up if you need to. Orient your grain such that, we mentioned a second ago, that the force is going to be perpendicular to the face of the board and parallel with your grain. But definitely try to avoid crushing your corrugations at all costs, because then you'll lose everything. The next thing we'll talk about is sandwich panels. One sheet is rarely enough for most serious projects, so you're going to want to make essentially plywood. Now, it's very important that you use as little glue as possible. When I'm doing my plywood, I'll just do dots or so every so often on maybe 2 or 3 inch centers, depending on what the project calls for. Use as little as you can, but as much as necessary. It's also very important that you use an odd number of sheets so that the warping forces cancel each other out. What this means is you're going to need, let's say the minimum you can build, of course, is 3. So you would orient it, if you had this sheet like this, your first layer's grain would go like that. Your second layer's grain, you would orient like this. Third layer's grain goes back like this. Just make sure that you have an odd number of sheets that you glue together, and use glue very sparingly on this one, because glue is wet and wet things cause cardboard to warp. So be careful with that, but you're definitely going to want to graduate to making sandwich panels. Here is an example of a 3 sandwich. I don't know if you can see, probably. You've got 2 grain here that's running right at you. The center section is offset 90 degrees, and this makes a very, very rigid structure. Now, of course, if you're going to cut this, also try to orient your cuts so that the major arcs are perpendicular to the direction that has the most grain running that way. So since in our example, most of our grain, 2 layers of it run this way, if we were going to cut an arc, we'd want to cut it like that, so it runs across as many corrugations as possible. And that'll give us a nice, precise curve. Well, that's about all I have for basic cardboard tips. I may have some advanced ones in the future, but knowing this stuff, this will get you a long way to building really cool stuff out of cardboard. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it.